Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're diving into the ultimate historical what-if. For over 4 decades, the Cold War defined our world. It shaped our politics, accelerated our technology, and even influenced the music we listen to. But what if the Cold War never happened? Imagine a world where the alliance that defeated the Axis powers in World War II didn't instantly fracture into 2 hostile, nuclear-armed camps. How would our history, politics, and society be different? Would we be more peaceful, more technologically advanced? Or perhaps simply dealing with a different set of global problems? Let's peel back the layers of this alternate reality. The absence of the Cold War, the systemic rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union, would create a fundamentally different global political landscape. The defining characteristic of the post-1945 era was the bipolar divide between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Without it, the international system might have been multipolar right from the start. We might see several regional great powers: a less dominant United States, a rising Western Europe, a major power in post-Mao China, and a still powerful Soviet Union, but one focused more on internal development and less on ideological expansion. What about the Soviet Union itself? The constant external threat and ideological mandate were key to maintaining its rigid, centralized control. Without the need to compete globally with the US, perhaps internal pressures for reform might have arisen sooner. Or, conversely, a longer, more stable, but less aggressive Soviet state could have endured. Then there's the story of decolonization. Newly independent nations in Africa and Asia would no longer be forced to choose a side in a global chess match. This could lead to truer independence and governance models less influenced by Cold War proxies. Conflicts like the Korean War or the Vietnam War might have been contained as local civil wars, potentially reducing their horrific scale and death tolls. Think about the internal struggles in places like Angola or Afghanistan. Without superpowers fanning the flames, their trajectories would have been entirely different. And what about the United Nations? With less constant veto-wielding rivalry in the Security Council, the UN might have functioned far more effectively. Imagine faster, more unified international responses to crises like genocide, famine, or regional conflicts. It could have been the global peacekeeper it was intended to be. Now, let's talk about technology. The Cold War was a massive accelerator for certain technologies, but it also diverted vast resources away from others. Take the space race. The drive to land a person on the moon was almost purely political, a display of ideological supremacy. Without that intense US-Soviet competition, a crewed mission to the moon might have been delayed by decades. But here's the flip side. The resources not spent on a competitive space race could have been pooled. We might have seen early international space cooperation, a truly global push for a space station or Martian missions, prioritizing scientific discovery over political one-upmanship. It would be science for the sake of science, not for bragging rights. Nuclear power is another interesting case. The technology for nuclear energy and weapons was inextricably linked. Without the immediate, desperate need for nuclear deterrence, the development of nuclear power might have been slower and more cautious. Perhaps we would have focused more on safety and waste disposal from the very beginning. And the device you're watching this on, its origins would be different too. The Internet evolved from the US military Project ARPANET, designed as a decentralized communications network that could survive a nuclear strike. Without that specific military need, the development of a global network might have been delayed or taken a completely different, commercially driven path, perhaps evolving through telephone companies instead of defense departments. The Cold War's shadow permeated daily life, from the arts to civil rights. Perhaps the most immediate societal change would be the absence of that pervasive nuclear fear, the duck and cover drills, the constant, gnawing threat of mutually assured destruction. Can you imagine growing up without that background anxiety? Society's psychology would be less focused on existential threat and more on long-term stability and progress. In the US, the intense anti-communist paranoia that fueled McCarthyism and the Hollywood blacklist would likely be significantly muted or non-existent. This would allow for greater freedom of political expression and a less scrutinized intellectual and artistic community. The creative landscape would be unrecognizable, and with no Iron Curtain, cultural exchange between East and West would flourish. Imagine the free flow of ideas, art, music, and literature. Russian ballet, American jazz, and Eastern European cinema could all merge and influence each other much sooner, creating a richer, more diverse global culture. What about the civil rights movement? This one is complex. In our history, the US had to reckon with its image abroad as it competed with the Soviet Union for the hearts and minds of the developing world. Soviet propaganda constantly highlighted American racial injustice. Without that external pressure, the civil rights movement might have faced a longer, harder, or more purely internal struggle without the geopolitical incentive for the US government to address its own hypocrisy. Finally, let's look at the economy. Trillions of dollars were spent globally on the arms race and military buildups. In this alternate world, that money would instead be available for domestic investment in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and sustainable development. Without the ideological divide, the global economy might have integrated faster and earlier, with less reliance on massive military-industrial complexes and a greater focus on international trade and cooperation. And with global attention not fixated on military competition, issues like climate change, pollution, and resource management might have risen to the top of the international agenda much sooner. It's possible we could have seen earlier global treaties and preventative action, putting us on a much greener path today. So, if the Cold War had never happened, we wouldn't be living in a utopia, but it would be a profoundly different world. It would be a world with different power dynamics, a weaker US hegemony, a softer Soviet Union, and stronger regional powers. It would be a world with delayed, yet perhaps more collaborative, space exploration, and a slower, more deliberate path to the internet. And most importantly, it would be a world without the 4-decade-long shadow of nuclear annihilation. But as we conclude, this alternate history leaves us with some profound questions. Would a lack of Cold War competition have made the West complacent, slowing down innovation rather than just redirecting it? Would a unified communist-led East have still collapsed, or would it have stabilized into a long-term, non-aggressive global power? And finally, is conflict, in some form, simply an inevitable byproduct of great power rivalry, regardless of ideology? We've only scratched the surface of this massive what-if. What do you think would have happened? If you enjoyed this journey into an alternate timeline, please do 3 things for us. Like this video to help us reach more history enthusiasts, subscribe for more deep dives into history's biggest questions, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me the one thing you think would be most different if the Cold War had never happened. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of history.